Hey, good afternoon, y'all. Thanks for joining us. This is Erik and Derek, Tiger Football Talk. We're two Clemson grads who love nothing more than to talk about Clemson football. And I know this weekend we were all missing out on the Clemson football game because, hey, it was a bye week. But there's plenty of stuff happening across the country, so we wanted to do a brief overview of an update on the injuries for Clemson. We wanted to kind of do an overview of each of the conferences and where they stand. And we wanted to do a little bit of contender, pretender. And some of these conferences, we've had enough games to be able to start labeling people who are in it for the college football playoff championship and some who simply are not. So before we jump into that, Erik, can you give us an update on the most talked about thing of last week, the Clemson injuries?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big issue, especially coming out of that Notre Dame game. But I would say, it's sad that there's no Clemson football this weekend, but it was a much-needed bye week for the Tigers. I mean, with the amount of injuries that we had, we needed this rest to heal up some of our players. The good news, Tyler Davis and Mike Jones, Dabo's kind of high on them. He feels like they're on the right target to get going. He's hopeful for them to start against Florida State. Definitely good news that they're at least trending in the right directions. Skalski is still out. He had that surgery on his groin. Not sure what the timetable is. It seems like it might be another week or two before we get Skalski back. Good news about Brsay. It was just a bruised knee. He's expected back from Florida State. No issues there moving forward. The big hit, though, was Frank Latson. Hurt his foot in that game. He's going to be out multiple weeks with that injury, and Nagata is still dealing with that core injury. He's week to week, but I think we all saw him on the field last Saturday against Notre Dame. It's still bothering him, and he's not 100%. I don't know if they're going to play him. If I were Clemson coaches, I'd probably sit him the next week or two and try to get him a little bit more healthy, kind of going into this playoff run. And the good thing, though, is all the other players that were banged up against Notre Dame seem to be making full recoveries, and they're all expected back for Florida State. No other setbacks. Another good thing that came out of this week was Dabo Bye week. He took a lot of heat for this loss at Notre Dame, but I'm really happy with what his response has been. It really seems like he has owned it. It really seems like he wants to go back and change and fix a lot of things that we've been talking about all season.
Yeah, I saw him mentioning a couple of things that you were, in fact, talking about. Going back to the injuries, it sounds like our defense will be at closer to full strength, but our offense is explicitly the playmakers on the outside. Seems like they're going to be struggling a little bit. Cornell Powell and Amari Rogers are going to be leaning on them more than ever for the Florida State matchup over the course of the next week. So let's go ahead and dive into, I guess one more thing is Darren Rencher was diagnosed with COVID, so he'll be going through the COVID protocols. He tested positive, so warm wishes out to him, wishing him a speedy recovery. As we know, Trevor Lawrence, his good friend, just went through the exact same protocol. So let's dive in. I want to kind of do a brief overview of some of the different conferences, some of the games that were played this week, and then we'll go into contender and pretender. So start off with the SEC. There were 4 games, 8 teams that did not play this week specifically because of COVID. We saw COVID rising throughout the country outside of college football, and it is starting to affect college football as well. These are the 8 teams that did not play: A&M, Tennessee, LSU, Alabama, which someone at LSU, I'm sure they faked a positive test just to be able to not play Alabama. That was going to be a 78-0 drudging, I'm sure. Georgia, Missouri, and Auburn, Mississippi State. So some highly ranked teams that unfortunately did not get to play this week. But from the little bit of games we did see, I did watch the Florida game. Kyle Trask and that Florida offense honestly is looking potent. They're normally known for a better defense. Their defense, I think, is a little bit off this year. But their offense, putting up 60-plus points to, I believe, a rebounding Arkansas team was definitely impressive to see.
Yeah, like you said, COVID really took a hit to the college football schedule this weekend. But some good games. That Florida team, Kyle Trask, he's really putting a name for himself, and he's trying to make a run at that Heisman with all these injuries and people sitting out. Florida's a contender for sure, and I'm looking to see their matchup against Alabama probably in that championship game later on in the season. ACC-wise, I was really excited for this Notre Dame-Boston College game. Phil Dracovic getting to play against his old team. The red bandana game. I was really excited to see Boston College come out flying. I thought Notre Dame might have a little bit of a hangover against Clemson. I was really curious to see if Notre Dame could kind of step up their game and elevate, and championship caliber teams play well week in and week out. And I was honestly surprised and pleasantly surprised that Notre Dame came out and played as well as they played against us. Ian Book continued to look athletic and was scrambling and making plays. Phil Dracovic, unfortunately, he made some good plays early, kind of fell into that turnover bug with the interceptions, and then once a game starts getting away from you, it's harder to stay in it. So props to Notre Dame in that one. And Miami somehow, I don't know what's in their Gatorade. I don't know what they're drinking, but they continue to make these fourth quarter comebacks and made it a game and beat Virginia Tech by 1 point in the fourth quarter. Huge comeback for Miami, staying in the top 10 in the top 25 playoff contention.
Hey, whatever Miami is drinking, Virginia Tech needs some of that. I don't know if you saw the ending to the Liberty game, just a heart-wrenching end to that game to lose at the end of the fourth quarter. And then, again, they controlled this game for the large majority, and they let Miami back in. I think we're going to, unfortunately, I like the coach over there at Virginia Tech. That fan base, they're starting to rumble. I think they had a lot of confidence coming into this year, and their record just does not show it, and they still have to play Clemson later on. So it's unfortunate the way that ball turned out. But looking at some of these other games, Florida State, obviously our next opponent, loses to NC State. I mean, they're really, I hate saying this for Florida State. College football is better when a couple of teams are on top, USC out in California. But Florida State's one of those powerhouse teams. You like to see them on top, and they are just solidifying their status as just one of the worst teams in the ACC as they lose to an NC State team that I think most would say is mediocre at best. Notre Dame, they were the only top 5 team to play this week, and they played just like a top 5 team. I know last week we were debating if they would belong to the Alabama and Ohio States of the world. I don't know if Clemson just let a spark underneath them or they just gave them the confidence to win, but Notre Dame really did look dominant against Boston College. I mean, through and through. And then one other game I do want to mention, UNC. I don't think UNC knows how to play defense. And similar to Miami, they keep coming back with these fourth quarter comebacks. I tuned in that game, and I think I can't remember exactly how much they were down, but I think they were down like 17 points at some point in time, and they scored 28 points in the fourth quarter. Sam Howell, every week we talk about him having just a career day. The guy has to throw for 400 plus yards every week, and they still barely win football games. But an exciting week. I think the ACC had some really exciting games this week.
Yeah, and I'm excited. I mean, ACC, you got 3 teams in the top 10. Clemson, Notre Dame, Miami. Strong showing, and really game day folks in Kirk Herbstreit, they're talking about the potential for 2 ACC teams making it into the playoffs. I mean, with the way that this college football season is shaping up with the ACC, SEC, and Big Ten, I mean, it seems like Ohio State's a lock. It seems like Alabama's a lock. If we can win out, it seems like we're a lock, and that it really is that fourth team is up for grabs. And they're all saying, I mean, if this ACC championship comes down to Notre Dame versus Clemson, take 2, and it's a close game or it's a good game, Notre Dame has a saying that they potentially could be that 4th spot. Elsewhere, we talked about Florida a little bit. I think Florida's a legit team, and I'm really excited to see their matchup against Alabama in the SEC championship game. But the Big 12 and the Pac-12, I don't know what's going on out there.
Yeah, I mean, so listen, there's Oregon and there's USC. USC had an underwhelming win this past weekend. Oregon was a little sloppy. Granted, they're in their second game. They had a longer layoff than most. Maybe it's going to take them some time to get back into it. They looked good, but if we're talking about top contenders, Pac-12, it's too early. No one's rushing out and beating up on the other ones. It's just a little sloppy out there for the time being. So I'm really not going to spend much time talking about the Pac-12. And then the Big 12 had 2 games this week. Nothing of relevance. To be honest, if we're talking about contenders, we're talking about conferences east of the Mississippi. That's really what we're talking about. So let's go ahead and dive on into it. I'm going to give you a different team each time, and you tell me contender or pretender. Some of these are going to be easier than others. I'm going to start you off with a softball of a question. Ohio State, contender, pretender?
Ohio State is a contender. And they're even more so a contender because I don't see anyone else in their conference that's going to put up a fight. I mean, Michigan goes down in another ugly loss. I mean, Jim Harbaugh's got to be fielding calls to get out of there because Michigan fans cannot be happy with what's going on over there. I see Ohio State cakewalking into the playoffs.
Now, You see, that's probably where you and I differ a little bit, because we're going to get into two other teams. I mean, let's put Wisconsin out there. I think they've only played 2 or 3 games. They've missed some games due to COVID, and I think if they miss one more game, they're not even eligible for the Big Ten championship. But they're looking good. I know it's against a Michigan team that win would have looked a lot better a few weeks ago, but now I think we're starting to understand that Michigan is just a train wreck, barreling down a hill at this point. But Wisconsin seems to have a quarterback. They seem to have good defense, and they will be playing another team we're going to be talking about shortly, Indiana, later on, and I think that's going to determine who goes to the Big Ten championship game. But are you contender, pretender on Wisconsin?
I think the jury's still out on Wisconsin. I think they could be a contender. I was really excited to see them come out and play as well as they did after being off for 2 weeks. They came out hot in their first game, and then COVID struck again, and they were out for They missed 2 football games. And the big question mark with Wisconsin isn't so much their talent, but they now have to play 5 straight games to make it into the championship game, and then they got to play that. I mean, they're going to have a lot of games in a row, and if anything goes, they don't have any room for error.
I'm actually going to look up their schedule right now where we're talking about it, because I remember looking at it and thinking to myself, they could be walking into this Big Ten championship and they may only have 6 wins, because a lot of these games are not going to get rescheduled. They're not going to be played later on. So we'll see about that one. Let's put a pause on that, and then we'll go back to Indiana, a team that, let's be honest, no one had them on their big board coming into the season. The majority of fans across the country cannot name a single player on the Indiana team, much less a coach or anybody else associated with it. But pleasantly surprised. They've beaten some decent teams, and they've done it in an impressive fashion. What do you say about Indiana?
I think Indiana is a really good football team. I don't think I'm going to put them in the category of pretender and or contender. I think they're kind of right there. I think they've played some teams that we all thought were better than they actually ended up being. It'll be interesting to see how they play down the stretch. But as of right now, I think they're a good team, a 10-win team. I don't know that they make it to the championship game, though.
Okay, so I'm looking at Wisconsin's schedule. So they play 2 games. They only have 4 games left. So they might be going to the Big Ten championship game 6-0 with a win against Indiana, which Indiana's ranked 9th right now, and they still have to play Northwestern. But this is the situation I want to talk about, because I think there's 3 conferences that could realistically get 2 teams into the college football playoff. And the Big Ten, now we're getting a little bit further along, might be one of those, because they still have 3 undefeated teams in Ohio State, Indiana, and Wisconsin. So if Wisconsin runs the table and meets up with Ohio State, and let's say they win against Ohio State, okay, they're probably in, but then Ohio State is probably going to be in either way as well. If Wisconsin runs the table and then loses to Ohio State in a close game in the Big Ten championship, they're 6-1. Do they make it into the college football playoff?
Well, I feel like every year we're always this far out, right? We're always 3 or 4 games left in the season. There's undefeated teams left. There's all these question marks of who's going to make it in, who's not going to make it in. And somehow it seems to always play itself out where most of these teams drop off, and they're really, that discussion for 4th place is between 2 teams, maybe 3 teams, with that 3rd team really being an outside shot.
Right, I agree. This is just a unique year, because now all of a sudden the amount of games that you normally have just for something crazy to happen. I mean, you're looking at Wisconsin, 6 games, and there's only 4 games left. Like, the amount of crazy is just getting whittled down smaller and smaller because there's just less and less games. That's going to be a conference that's going to be interesting to see moving forward. But let's go ahead. We'll move on off to a different conference. Let's go to our home conference in Notre Dame. Thoughts on Notre Dame, contender, pretender, rest of the year?
I mean, lately, Notre Dame looks like a contender. I think if they can they've got the O-line and the D-line to play with anybody in the nation, and if they can keep playing on offense and defense the way that they've been playing, they're a contender. Like I said, I'm excited to see them again in the ACC championship game, as long as that all kind of works out the way that we think it will. I think that's going to be an amazing rematch, and that game is really going to dictate who's in from the ACC into this top 4.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what ends up happening in the rest of the country. That game could be a non-deciding factor. Maybe both of these teams are going to get in. If Clemson wins, maybe both gets in. If Clemson loses, you're not going to get in with 2 losses. But if Clemson wins the rematch, I don't think a lot of people are going to say, hey, Notre Dame, you really can't get in. But again, it's going to depend on all these other teams that we're talking about. But you're right. Notre Dame, we referenced a few weeks ago the Louisville game where they were kind of sleepwalking through it, didn't look crisp and sharp. The last two games, they're flying around the defensive side of the ball, even though they have given up some points to both teams. But their offense has come alive. Ian Book, that running game. It's not the offensive line, yes, but these running backs are being unbelievably physical. The amount of times I saw the announcer say Boston College had a missed tackle, it wasn't really a missed tackle. It was the running back barreling over a safety or a corner who had no interest in making that tackle. So let's move on to the next one, which is Clemson. Is Clemson a contender or pretender where we sit right now?
We're a contender, but we definitely need to clean up our act, and we definitely need to get our players healthy. Hopefully this bye week does both of those things for us. We've got a pretty easy next 3 games going into the ACC championship game. Hoping that we can make quick work of all that and come out unscathed. Hoping with Trevor Lawrence back, we can kind of get our quarterback back of the offense and kind of be able to run the tables moving forward. I think if we can get back to where we kind of started with our offense and defense clicking, I think we could play with anybody in the nation.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that Clemson's a pretender, not a contender. I think they are. But if you're looking at our team, like all these teams we're talking about, do they have a solid run game? Absolutely. Do they have good defense? Most do. We're struggling with injuries. Our defense has seemed a little unhinged the last 2 weeks. I think that's Clemson, yes, but almost with a question mark at the end of it. Because if it's Clemson right now, I don't think so, because we don't have Trevor Lawrence today. We will by the time we take the field. We're not running the ball particularly well. Our defense is struggling with injuries. So I think it all depends about going to the ACC championship game. What does our team look like in order for us to move forward with that?
Yeah,
so let's move on to.
I'm really curious to see how we play the rest of our schedule, because as of right now, we're a very young team. I don't know that gets broadcasted enough. I mean, we talk about our O-line and our struggles. That O-line, only one of them is a returning starter. So as much as we get players in and out and get playing time, this is a very young team on both sides of the ball. And I think the way that our schedule has kind of played out, and with the injuries that have played out this year, I think they're getting a lot of valuable lessons and a lot of valuable film that I'm hoping these coaches can turn into progressing these players along.
Exactly. How they may look in late October, early November versus the end of the year. That's a lot more tape. That's a lot more coaching that you can do along the way. Speaking of another team that I think has progressed, which is Alabama. Not necessarily their offense. I think their offense came out on fire, but their defense, obviously contender, pretender for Alabama.
Oh, they're an absolute contender, and I think that the hardship that they went through with Waddle going down with a season-ending injury early on, and their fight to come back, and Mac Jones and all the wide receivers in that offense to continue to produce at a high level. I'm really excited to see this SEC championship game, whoever it is, probably Alabama versus Florida. I think that's going to be basically a playoff game. I think it's going to be a very good game. I think, if it is Clemson versus Notre Dame, that's another very good game, and it'll be exciting to see those games even before we get to the playoffs.
Yeah, I know. I'm kind of licking my chops already. Like these championship games for these conferences are going to be incredibly meaningful in these 3 conferences between the Big Ten, the ACC, and the SEC. Alabama, yes, their schedule is a little bit easier the rest of the way. Unfortunately, LSU just wasn't what it was supposed to be, and then that game got canceled. Auburn, similarly, I don't think anyone's scared to play Auburn right now. But when you look at Alabama going to be matched up against Florida, that's 2 potent offenses. So let's move on over to Florida, the presumed winner of the SEC East, and the eventual matchup against Alabama in the SEC championship. Contender, pretender.
I think they're a contender, and I think Kyle Trask has made them a contender. You talked about it earlier. Florida's always been a defensive school that has kept their opponents to low numbers, and their offense just put up enough to try to be in the game. Yeah. I mean, Kyle Trask had 6 touchdown passes to the point where they took him out of the game because they were up by so much. I'm excited to see them moving forward. It's also good to see in the SEC another high caliber offense that also has the complementary defense with that. We've always seen these teams like Georgia that have had great defenses, and the offense has been questionable. We have these teams like Ole Miss who can put up 80 points, but they can't hold their opponents to below 80, so they end up losing. So it's exciting to see Florida come along. I think they're a contender, and I'm excited to see what they do the rest of the season as well.
Absolutely. So if Florida runs the table, meets up with Alabama, they lose, presumably they're out. They're 2-loss SEC team, and they're not winning their own conference. If they win, if Florida runs the table, manages to beat Alabama close, again, I know I'm throwing a lot of what ifs, but that's because these situations are not only a possibility, they're actually somewhat likely. If you look at the tier system we kind of have in college football, there seems to be the haves seem to be more powerful this year than in years past versus the have-nots. Florida runs the table, beats Alabama, they're into the football playoff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really curious to see when this playoff ranking committee comes out and starts ranking these teams, because, we talked about it earlier. It really, to us, seems like a 3-conference game, right? It's ACC, SEC, right, and Big Ten. I don't see any of these conferences out west really doing a whole lot. Oregon had a really sloppy win this weekend. They didn't really stake their claim to anything. So I'm really curious. And then I'm curious to see the whole, this division played 11 games and this only played 6. Like, how does that play into it? Because there is a lot more to playing a full season versus a shortened season. So that's why these championship games are going to be so big, because there's the potential for 2 teams to make it in from any one of these divisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The next team that I want to talk about, I think, is interesting. The reason I'm asking about Florida, Florida's lone loss is to A&M, which right now is the number 5 team in the country. A&M more than likely will not get the opportunity to play in the SEC championship game. A&M's one loss is to Alabama. Alabama's undefeated. Alabama need to lose twice to have A&M jump, and I just don't see that happening. So is there a way, actually I'll say contender or pretender, and then I'll ask you, is there a way A&M can make it into the college football playoff?
I don't see them as a contender for the top 4. Again, I kind of rank them into that. They're a really good 10-win season kind of squad. Yeah, Jimbo Fisher has always done great things with teams. I'm not sure that Jimbo Fisher has really progressed along with the rest of the nation. He still runs this pro-style, very slow, methodical offense. He's got a good defense. I just think when you're going up against an Alabama or Ohio State, the way that Jimbo Fisher coaches this offense and calls these plays and his schemes, if his defense isn't holding these other teams to low numbers, I don't see him being a contender. I think he needs to either hire an offensive coordinator or adjust his play style a little bit, because I think he's always, no matter how much talent he gets, he's always going to be in this 10-win kind of, 10-win season, especially in the SEC.
Yeah, and I think the last few years they've been more like an 8 or 9-win season team, but something that's not talked about very much is the SEC West just does not look dominant like it used to be. Alabama looks as good as any team, but the Mississippi schools, they've been down for a few years, and then you look at LSU and Auburn in particular, usually not only top 25 teams, we're talking about like top 15, top 10, usually have those 3 in the top 10, and they've not been very good. And honestly, I think Texas A&M, I'm going to say pretender. I think A&M is just taking advantage of the fact that, listen, this conference, especially on this side of the conference, it's not that good this year. Arkansas is making strides, I guess, but I'm going to say pretender on that one as well. I'm going to go to one. I know we mentioned earlier, like, hey, listen, all the contenders are basically east of Mississippi, especially from those conferences east of Mississippi with A&M. Oregon, it's early. They've had 2 games, undefeated. What are your initial thoughts on them?
Look, I think if you're in any one of these conferences that is playing a shortened season, you know that every game is the most important game. Dabo preaches that all the time in the full season. If you're playing a shortened season, you have only a limited number of games to prove to the country that you deserve a spot in the top 4. Oregon came out this weekend and laid an egg. Sure, did they win? Yes. Was it super sloppy? Yeah, and that's always going to be on their record. You can't get away from that. To me, it doesn't matter how well they play down the stretch. But that game this weekend, to me, made them a pretender.
Absolutely, and one thing that Notre Dame fans, I think, are kind of being upset about is they feel disrespected. With the Clemson and the injuries, that's why they won the game. the thing is, like, there's only a couple of teams in college football right now that get the benefit of the doubt, and that's Clemson, that's Ohio State, and that's Alabama. If you're an out west team like an Oregon, I'm sorry, you're not getting the benefit of the doubt. You have to be flashy. You have to go out and pummel teams. You have to gain the attention from basically an East biased, college football situation. So if you look at their first two games, it just hasn't been that way. You have to come up and really do something in order to say that you belong. It's early. Maybe they can still get together and just become a dominant force. But yeah, we'll just go ahead and overlook them for the time being. This is where I really want to get into that, because we've talked about, and I do believe that the Big Ten, ACC, and the SEC can all put two teams into 4 spots. And those are just 6 teams right there. Now the out of conference, the Power 5 programs like Cincinnati, who has an incredible defense, great defensive line, coached by the old from Fickell, who used to coach the Ohio State, great defense. What do you think about Cincinnati?
I'm always rooting for the underdogs, and I'm always rooting for these teams that are playing as well as Cincinnati is playing to have a shot, right? I want them to be a contender, and I want them to be in the top 4 because I want them to get rewarded for what they've done so far this season. Unfortunately for them, I kind of talked about it a couple of weeks ago, is you just don't know how good they really are against the Power 5 competition. I mean, we look back at years past with UCF, who declared themselves national champions because they felt they were undefeated and they felt like they were that good. Right. And then when they finally got the chance to play a Power 5 team, they lost. And a year later, same thing. They went to a New Year's Six Bowl and they lost. So I want them to be in there, and I want them to be a contender. But I think the jury's still out on that. I think it'd be interesting to see if they make it to the top 4. I don't know that they will, but it'll be interesting to see what bowl game they're placed in and how well they do in that.
Yeah, and UCF, they did it based off of prolific offense, wasn't going to be able to hold up. They were able to compete. I think they lost to LSU. I do think they beat Auburn, because one of my best friends is an Auburn fan and still laments that fact. If you look at Cincinnati, because they're built on defense, again, it's tough to know how they hold up against an Ohio State or an Alabama of the world, but they've been looking impressive. And then BYU, who is coming off of an impressive win last week against Boise State, who have one of the best quarterbacks in the country in Zach Wilson, who's come out of nowhere and is playing his way into a first-round draft status. What are your thoughts on BYU? Are they able to sneak in?
I don't think so. I think they're far enough away from this that they're not going to be able to sneak in. I do think that you're right. Their quarterback play has been at the next level and is in Heisman contention for how well he has played. I don't know that they're a pretender. I think they're a very good team. I just don't think that they have enough, solid, book of work on how good of a team that they will be, and I don't think that they're going to be on the outside looking in on this one.
Gotcha. Now let me pose it to you this way. So that kind of runs through the list that I really wanted to talk about. But if the top 3 teams do win out, so that means that Ohio State wins the Big Ten championship, beats presumed Wisconsin or Indiana. If Notre Dame beats Clemson a second time, and if Alabama wins against Florida, that puts the number 4 in a really precarious situation. Clemson will have 2 losses. You have a Wisconsin team with 6 wins but a loss, an Indiana team with at least 1 loss at this point, Florida team with a 2 loss. Is that where you can see maybe a Cincinnati or a BYU sneaking? Right now we're saying all these conferences have options, but those options only come into place if there's an upset. If these teams do win out, if the top 3 do, who gets that 4th spot?
You know what? I do see that. If that is the way that it plays out, I do see that as an opportunity for a Cincinnati to sneak into that number 4 spot. If they win out and some of these teams, go on and win out like you said, and those other teams that we're talking about, the Florida, the Clemson, they end up with that second loss. They potentially are on the outside looking in. I think a lot of that will come down to how those games were played. Is it a double overtime loss? Are there injuries? Is there something that we don't know about right now? But that's definitely the game script that Cincinnati is looking for to hopefully sneak their way into this.
And that's why I think this year is going to be more interesting than years past, because I think you're going to have chaos either way. You either are going to have these top 3 teams that everyone thinks are unbeatable right now, maybe top 2 teams that everyone thinks unbeatable, if they go through and win, you still have chaos for that fourth spot. If any of them lose, you now have chaos to figure out, well, now is one conference getting two players in or two teams in? So I think either way, you're going to have a little bit of chaos. You're going to see what bias is going to be out there. I think this is one of the more intriguing seasons to watch to see who will make it into the Final Four.
It is. I definitely think there's a lot more challenges this season, obviously with COVID happening, with the reduced schedules, with more players being injured, less time to prepare. I'm really looking for the College Football Playoff Committee's rankings. I think that's going to tell us a lot about how they think about these teams right now and moving forward, and that'll really kind of set up how these teams move around moving towards the end of the season.
Couldn't agree more. Anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
Hey, if you like our content, help us out. Like, subscribe. Every little bit helps. Click the button down here. It really helps us out on our YouTube channel and helps us keep bringing you quality content week in, week out.
Absolutely. We're also on Instagram, so feel free to find us there. And then we will see you guys on Thursday to break down the matchup with Florida State.
Go Tigers.
Go Tigers.